Every week, there are still hundreds of refugees that try to cross the borders between Turkey and Greece. In fact, hundreds manage to cross and arrive safely on European ground without being pushed back to Turkey. In this podcast, we want to discuss the agency that is in control of these external European borders, Frontex. We are a group of master students at the Geneva Graduate Institute studying international and development studies. I'm Anina and I will introduce you to the topic of this podcast, Frontex and human rights violations in the Aegean Sea. We will conduct an interview with a scholar about transparency and accountability, and will put her answers into a larger context. Frontex was created by the EU and has worked at the European external borders since 2004. It's mostly known for its border control measures. Frontex works closely with EU member states, especially to implement the regulation, but also to support the communication and cooperation between member states and other agencies. To give you an insight into the situation of a refugee, I would like to introduce you to Stefani, a Cameroonian who tried to cross the Aegean Sea in February 2022. For privacy and security reasons, her real name was changed. The Aegean Sea is separating Turkey and some Greek islands like Lesbos, Chios, and Samos. The few kilometers that separate Asia and Europe are some of the most controlled areas worldwide. This is why Stefani's first attempt to enter Europe was not successful.
The Greek police catch us on the sea and they took our engine, they put us on their boats and they searched us, they took everything for us and they beat us very well. They took us near to Vasi, near to the Greek port, put us in the basket. They sent us to the Turkish side and then put us in the basket and then leave. In that basket, when you hear people are dying on the sea, it's from the basket because the basket is small. And when they just put you in the basket, they just fling you people like this, like dustbin, you understand? Not in order. They are so wicked. They are so wicked. Go back to Turkish. We don't have money. Greek don't have money. Go back to your poor country, African poor people.
Stefani's boat was found by the Greek police, who took away their engine and pulled them close to the Greek port. They beat them and put them in the so-called baskets, small inflatable black rubber boats. Then the Greek police took them back to the sea and left. This is called an illegal pushback, intercepting migrants when they cross land borders or enter a state's territorial waters and pushing them back into another jurisdiction. 3 weeks later, she made a second attempt, which eventually succeeded.
So the second time, the Greek police saw us. So when they come, they started shoot gun. They shoot gun. Stop. Go back. And they came and they jammed us like this. They wanted to turn us in the sea. And the engine stops. So our boat now go and stand where there was big rock stone. All of us will go down now on the rock and we'll run. We go inside the bush, we hide. So they used the drum, they started searching us in the bush. They catch many people in the bush. We saw them. We were hiding inside the bush.
After they arrived on the Greek island of Samos, they were hiding from the Greek police. Although the refugees were already on the Greek territory, they were still afraid to be pushed back again. Initially, 37 people were in the boat with Stefani. However, only 16 arrived in the refugee camp. The principle of non-refoulement is a fundamental right in both international and EU law. It prohibits the return of individuals to territories where they may be at risk of persecution, torture, or other ill treatment. This means that Greece has to give everyone protection and bring them to a refugee camp. Because the Greek authorities don't grant refugees this right, they thereby commit a human rights violation. You might wonder why we are talking about Frontex in this podcast, while Stefani is clearly speaking about the Greek police. According to their mandate, it is clear that Greece remains responsible for their external borders. Yet, under human rights law, Frontex is obliged to take all reasonable measures to protect individuals from human rights abuses. So even if they do not actively engage in human rights abuses, and the Greek Coast Guard is conducting the pushbacks, the omission of such protection is illegal under international law. With this podcast, we don't only want to look at the violations that are being committed, but try to go one step further and ask how future human rights violations can be prevented. We are looking closer at Frontex, because it is in charge of all the EU borders and has the power to make the crossing of the Aegean Sea for people like Stefani less precarious.
We want to discuss the role of Frontex in a personal interview. I'm Nora and I have the pleasure to talk with Laura Salzano, a Ph.D. candidate in international law at the University of Barcelona. She specialised in EU migration law and border control. Besides her academic career, Laura is a legal officer at Stop Mare Mortum, where as part of a legal team she engages in strategic litigation to open legal and safe pathways to Europe, and is a volunteer at Europe Cares, a humanitarian NGO that supports refugees in Lesbos. Her experiences include working at the Council of Europe in the Office of the Special Representative on Migration and Refugees, and at the European Parliament in the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs. Laura, thank you so much for being here. Can you first tell us about your personal motivation to work on the topic of Frontex and human rights violations at the EU borders?
Thank you so much for having me here. I've always been interested in human rights in general, and then I developed a specific interest in refugee rights when I first interacted with refugees, first in Bosnia and then in Sicily, where I come from. And I started working in the field around 2017 when my government was starting to take hard measures against refugees. Also, I am from Sicily, so I come from an external border, and I witnessed many of the things that people were watching at the news.
You refer to the pushbacks of refugees at the European external borders. Earlier, we heard about the role of Frontex and how the agency failed to prevent these human rights violations. I'm asking myself how this is possible. What internal control mechanisms exist to ensure Frontex compliance with human rights?
So, first of all, there is a fundamental rights officer that is responsible to contribute to the strategy on fundamental rights, and therefore this person should have a say in any strategy beforehand and make sure the way the strategy is being delineated complies with human rights. There are fundamental rights monitors. There should be up to 40 working in the field and monitoring that Frontex actions comply with fundamental rights. There is a complaint mechanism provided into the regulation, allowing any person directly affected by an action or an omission, a failure to act of the agency, to lodge a complaint to have their case assessed. And finally, there are the serious incident reports, whose goal is to inform the authorities about indeed a serious incident that can be fundamental rights related or not.
There have been multiple investigations conducted to find the reasons allowing for the misconduct of Frontex. One of them was led by OLAF, the European Anti-Fraud Office. It is mandated to conduct independent investigations concerning fraud and corruption involving EU funds. Based on the report of the OLAF investigation and other sources you have analyzed, can you tell us why these mechanisms weren't effective in the case of pushbacks at the Aegean Sea?
Well, many reasons. What emerged, for example, from the Olaf report is that the fundamental rights officer was not allowed to access the relevant information to implement his mandate. About the compliance mechanisms, some news outlet a few years ago reported that employees of the agency were warmly encouraged not to lodge any, or in general not to raise any issue related to fundamental rights. So I believe that we can say, and also Olaf said that there is a culture at the moment within the agency not allowing for this internal mechanism to be effective.
In view of the fact that it was so easy for the agency to eliminate these numerous internal control mechanisms or to minimize their effectiveness, which external institutions are able to step in and control Frontex?
So, according to the regulation, the agency is accountable to the European Parliament and the Council. I will take the Council out of this analysis because that is where member states sit, and the member states also sit in the management board, and they strongly support Frontex. The European Parliament, on the other hand, well, the effectiveness of the monitoring activity of the Parliament is debatable. It mostly relates to the budget approval and budget discharge, this latter being a merely political act. And as for the rest, it mostly needs to be informed on relevant issues of the agency, and only in rare occasions it is called to decide beforehand. Then there is a forum called Consultative Forum, where human rights experts sit and are called to deliver opinion on specific matters concerning the fundamental rights impact of the agency. For example, besides many NGOs, there is the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union and the Council of Europe. Of course, it is also subjected in theory to the Court of Justice of the European Union oversight. What has happened so far is that the court has never successfully delivered an opinion, a ruling concerning the agency. And finally, there is also legal basis for national parliaments to step up their involvement and operate a control similar to the one that the European Parliament operates at supranational level, but at national level through their representatives there.
This part of the interview with Laura focused on the mechanism of accountability, and now me, Marina, and my colleague Shilpa will further discuss and analyze these mechanisms.
So Laura has explained the internal and external mechanisms of accountability in great detail, and it is evident that both these types of mechanisms failed since human rights violations continued to happen.
And this is an extremely dangerous situation, since an agency with such heavy responsibility must be kept in line with an effective controlling apparatus, which in this case was the EU institutions.
However, Laura mentioned that there was a culture which did not allow the internal mechanisms to be effective. In this context, it is important to note that there were employees within Frontex who disagreed with Frontex's actions, but they couldn't express their opinions or protest as they were under huge pressure from the management board.
We know that the management board has actively tried to cover up the human rights violations taking place. This board currently consists of members from the states hosting the mission and 2 members from the European Commission. This reveals the part of the European Commission itself, which should serve as an external control mechanism, was also involved in these cover-ups, which is shocking.
Even though so many external mechanisms exist, none of them worked effectively. As Laura mentioned, budget approval is one of them. After investigations and reports of human rights violations relating to Frontex came up, the European Parliament in October 2022 disapproved the discharge of Frontex's budget for 2020. This is certainly a success for human rights, but it is not enough.
The European Parliament that created this agency should have greater control over it and should have constantly monitored its actions and inactions.
In the end, the only actors who made an effort to ensure accountability were civil society and NGOs that filed cases against Frontex on behalf of refugees at the European Court of Justice. But again, as Laura mentioned, the court has never successfully delivered a ruling on the Frontex violations. So this forum has failed as well.
To conclude, there were and are still no functioning mechanisms of accountability within the EU institutions that control Frontex effectively. In this case, other actors are needed to bring this misconduct to light and inform the public. How was this possible in the case of Frontex?
This was a great success for civil society because none of this would have been possible without the extremely courageous work that human rights activists at external borders have been doing for the last 15 years, while no one was listening to them and they were being increasingly criminalized by the governments. When it comes to the Aegean Sea, it is mostly thanks to the work of Aegean Boat Report that started publishing data every day about human rights violations taking place there. That got the attention of investigative journalists, and they published the first investigation in 2020, on which basis the European Parliament held the first hearing in 2020. It was December, and Leggeri was called to present his point of view on these facts that were being shared by journalists. That was starting a whole chain of events that is just leading here, because after that, Olaf started investigations, wrote the report that was then leaked, and we're now discussing how to improve the accountability of the agency. But all of this was not starting within the rooms of official institutions. All of this was starting in the island in Greece, where people alone and against everyone were spending their time serving the weakest of our society.
Olaf launched 3 different investigations. One of them was completed in February 2022. However, the report was not published, although experts say that its content is in public interest and therefore should have been published according to the transparency regulation of the EU. However, the finalized report led to the resignation of the former executive director Fabrice Leggeri. Yet, neither he nor any one of those involved in the documented human rights violations are facing legal prosecution for violating EU law. So what were the actual consequences of the report?
I would say there are many on a different level. First of all, it was the first time that a EU body certified such a massive breach in the rule of law operated with the complicity of a new agency. I think it's also a big failure for the European Union and the rule of law in general. Not only the fact that this has happened under everyone's eyes, because activists and lawyers have been saying that for years, but also that there is not being any formal legal action being initiated by those who could have done that before and after the Olaf report was published. I think that the most important one is that what happened when the Olaf report was concluded and not published is that that was representing the only way in which informations on the activity of the agency could be accessed. And the fact that the European Commission decided not to share it, I believe, sends a very bad signals to citizens and everyone believing in the rule of law and EU institutions. Apart from this, now it's published thanks to the very courageous work of some journalists. And I believe that the most important consequence is that if someone needs to use that in order to have their right assessed when they consider and they claim that their rights were being violated by the agency, they have an official document produced by a new body to do so. So until now, I would say that the consequences have been merely political, which of course is not enough. There is a structural problem within the agency that needs a structural solution. In order to do so, the report can be instrumental if that helps bringing responsible for the violations before court and having a ruling certifying what we all know by now.
Transparency is important so that institutions work according to their mandate and remain accountable to the public at large. It is only through transparency that people whose rights have been violated have a chance to defend them. Otherwise, there is no rule of law but a state of impunity.
Even if the fundamental rights officer within Frontex was restricted in its activities, other civil society actors like NGOs and journalists could have accessed these documents and brought attention to this issue much faster than they could now.
Transparency is also important because in cases where accountability is not ensured, it is crucial that this is reported and people learn about the processes and failures within the agency. That is why the decision of the European Commission not to publish the Olaf report undermined the trust of European Union citizens. Especially after the report was leaked and the actions of Frontex revealed, it became clear that the European Union authorities prevented the publication to cover up their misconduct and lessen media scrutiny.
Trust between the EU citizens and the European system is extremely important because trust is what gives legitimacy to democratic institutions. And for the EU, democracy is obviously very important as one of the fundamental values uniting all member countries. So an erosion of trust brings instability to this democratic system, which would make the entire EU institution weaker.
The lack of transparency and accountability mechanisms in the context of human rights violations against refugees and breaches of EU law undermines EU democracy and the principle of rule of law. What has to be improved to hold Frontex accountable and prevent human rights violations in the future?
If I needed to identify just two things, I would say that transparency is one, and the other one is identifying a clear chain of command. So the first one is transparency, which you already mentioned, because at the moment, the regulation that applies to Frontex says that they are allowed to decide themselves if sharing a document or not, which sometimes can be very beneficial to them to protect themselves. I believe that an ad hoc third independent body would be better to ensure judicial and social accountability of the agency. Two, clear chain of command, because what happens in this moment is that there are so many actors involved. For example, the member state hosting the mission, the other member states cooperating, Frontex itself coordinating everything and delineating the missions, that no one is really responsible de facto, even if de jure, the regulation says that member states and Frontex share the responsibility. Where to draw the line between the two is not clear at the moment. So, in order to solve that, probably identifying a clear chain of command for every mission would help a lot, so that there is someone responsible always that answers to the court if something happens.
So clearly, for things to improve, there needs to be a major change. The fundamental rights officer must be given greater independence and authority within Frontex so that not even the management board can curtail their actions or restrict their access to information.
To prevent human rights violations, a special mechanism can be created within the frames of the EU. Laura mentioned that the Council is not an effective control mechanism, as the member states are also on the management board and strongly support Frontex. In order to improve the efficiency of the control mechanism, an alternative council can be created, which will consist of European Parliament and Commission representatives, coming out of countries without a dependent relationship with the host states involved.
And this council would then present to the European Parliament their own independent report on the situation on the ground and about Frontex's activities in that region. This way, the reports submitted by Frontex won't be the only source of information, but there would be a completely independent watchdog who are in no way influenced by the politics of the host states.
To conclude our interview, can you tell us and the people listening what we can do to support the implementation of these improvements?
I would say get involved and expect and demand accountability from public institutions. No one is above the law, and if that reflects negatively on the weakest on our society, this is a problem we all have, and not only the direct addressees of those measures. If we always do that on the issues that we care about, of course, we cannot follow everything. I really believe that society will be different. I know it sounds naive, but we really have a lot of power. We can decide if delegating this power completely or taking some of this power in our hands by getting informed and following what they do and complain where we don't like what they do and demand that they respect the law.
Laura definitely has a point while speaking about the negative effects on the most vulnerable in our societies. For this to improve, it is crucial that the notion of emergency is taken advantage of in order to listen to the affected people, draw attention to the problem, carefully evaluate its sources, and demand that politics brings about change.
There should be built a space for political subjectivities and different political critics to emerge in state and EU politics in order to bring changes and to better the situation at the external borders.
Only then this moral and political dilemma can be resolved. Hence, after the reveal of the Olaf report, knowing that political reasons were behind the decision of never publishing the report, structural changes are necessary within the political EU controlling mechanisms.
However, to enhance these changes, every citizen should be involved in politics and should consider themselves responsible and able to embody these changes into real life. As Antonio Gramsci noted in 1967, following a critique of the crisis, the space of political change is revealed to be the space of conscious action.
This topic remains an important subject to this day because human rights violations are still present in the daily lives of refugees. Without public attention on Frontex's violations, we would not be able to achieve the fundamental changes that are so essential to improve their situation and guarantee them their basic human rights.
The reason why I believe that this is something that concerns us all is that this whole system is incredibly unjust and that is developing at the expenses of the most vulnerable in our societies that not only will need but are also entitled to find protection. And the fact that not only we're not providing this protection, but on top of that, we are subjecting them to a painful life is expression of a type of society that we need to decide if we want to contribute to or not.